All right, hi everyone. So this is first live stream that I've done on this channel. Hopefully you guys will find this interesting. I don't actually expect really anyone to turn up for the live part, but this is just a convenient way for me to record. So what I want to do here is talk about some of the points that were discussed on a recent video where, hang on, I'll bring it up. Yeah, where Nathan from Digital Gnosis was talking with Stuart and Rob from askcliffe. So this is not really a channel that I've really interacted with at all before, and I haven't really seen anything from these guys. But just because I've been doing videos with Nathan recently, I was interested in what they got talking about, and I found this to be one of the most difficult videos to get through that I have ever seen on YouTube. In fact, I haven't quite listened to all of it yet. I did get through most of it before deciding that I wanted to have a few things to say about it. So what I think is interesting about this is just how much Stuart and Rob throw out so many ridiculous, unsubstantiated, poorly thought out claims. And what you actually see is Nathan trying to respond to them in a reasonable way, sort of having to construct a case for them and then respond to that at the same time. So anyway, I just thought this would be a little interesting exercise to go through and sort of see some of the really, I think, disingenuous and unhelpful tactics that are used in these sorts of discussions. These guys do these sorts of discussions regularly, I think, often in person, and I assume they use similar techniques there. So I thought it would be maybe of interest to some people to see some of the fallacious reasoning or just flat out ridiculous assertions that are made. So I might jump around the video a bit just to focus on the things that I think are particularly egregious. So let's jump in and start with this, where Nathan's just talking about like belief in general, and we'll sort of move from there.
There is that God exists. There's enough evidence for this belief.
Yeah. So I will come to that. There's a couple of things as well, because there was a lot said that maybe it's worth saying first. So yeah, when we're talking about knowledge, and obviously there's this whole debate about how do we even define knowledge? What does that mean? And I think it's pretty safe to say that there's probably very few things that we can say that we know. Knowledge seems to be a kind of belief where we sort of are sure of the truth of it, and the truth is guaranteed somehow by the way we form that belief or something like that. There's always these kind of edge cases where you can like make there's a series of lucky events that mean that it's not true or something like that. But I think there's probably very few propositions that we can say we know, and I wouldn't want to say knowledge is like something that someone has to have a religious belief.
How do you know that? How do you know there's only a few propositions that we can know?
Well, so just from like my studying of the literature on this, so for example, like reading the ancient Pyrenean skeptics, who have like a lot of arguments, say like from the modes of sensory experience, like you would have heard one of the ones that I said about the heat and the cold, or for example, like Agrippa's trilemma. So like if we're talking about what justifies our beliefs, are our beliefs completely unjustified? Are they justified in a circular notion, or is there an infinite regress of justification? And how do you get out of that trilemma of justification for our beliefs? When we come on to maybe more modern philosophy with Descartes, who's addressing, who's kind of reviving some of these Pyrenean skeptical arguments, but he's again talking about the idea of how can I guarantee the truth of the sensory experiences I'm having? How can I verify that I'm not in a dream? How can I guarantee the external world, etc.? And he provides various arguments. And then even into the more modern philosophical literature. So some of the things I was mentioning about luck would be what's called like Gettier cases. So people used to say, well, knowledge is defined as a justified true belief. But then there's these cases that people can come up with where someone has a justified true belief, but it seems like they don't have knowledge. So say, for example, I always have like bad examples to hand. So like you saw me driving a Toyota. So you formed the belief that I own a Toyota or something. But the car I was driving was actually, one of my parents or something. But it happens that I also do actually own a Toyota. But it's a different car, and so it's like, in what sense can you really say that you knew that I owned a Toyota based on that case? Because because of kind of blind luck, it turns out to be true. So it seems then like at least from a philosophical perspective, like this question of like what's really like knowledge. There's very few propositions. Some people will say only claims like like I know that I'm thinking as I think this thought, and that's this isn't just me. This is Saint Augustine, who Descartes copying from when he comes up with the cogito.
Right. I would say with.
So just a comment there. So what Nathan has done here is respond to the question, basically, why be skeptical? So that Nathan claimed that there's only a few propositions that we can be really confident about. He was asked, why I think that. And so he's just outlined in brief a few sort of general lines of skeptical argument about the unreliability of sensory perceptions, about general skeptical concerns. I think he mentioned Pyrrhonian skepticism. He mentioned the Gettier cases about how knowledge claims that we might want to make might be undermined by different circumstances. So he's just put out a few things there that are sort of, general ideas that are, discussed in the philosophical literature concerning things that may defeat our attempts to make knowledge claims. So this is a general sort of move towards skepticism, I think, and there's a lot to discuss there. So let's see what the response is to that.
With that, a very few people live their lives believing that they don't know anything. I mean, if you look at the writings of like Edgar Allan Poe, and what he said, he posited this question: is all that we see or seem but a dream within a dream? I mean, you were highlighting that, Nathan, like the circular kind of dead end that goes towards. I mean, you can only doubt your perceptions so much. You have to act as if there's enough evidence to live off of that. There's that old saying that there's no atheists in foxholes. This
really bothered me because, I mean, there are atheists in foxholes. I think there's like an actual organization called Atheists in Foxholes. Let me just double check that so that I'm not saying false things. I remember seeing this somewhere here. The statement there are no atheists in foxholes is an aphorism to argue that in times of extreme stress or danger, such as during war, people believe in or hope for a higher power. Notable counterexamples. Several atheist organizations object to the phrase. The Military Association of Atheists and Free Thinkers has adopted the catchphrase atheists in foxholes to emphasize that the original statement is just an aphorism and not a fact. Over 200 members of this organization publicly display their military service in order to show that there are atheists in foxholes and on ships and in planes. Yeah, so that's just, there's a Wikipedia page, there are no atheists in foxholes. So, I mean, this is an aphorism, but the question is, what's the point of the aphorism? It's literally not true that everyone turns to a higher power in situations like that. So what are we supposed to infer from this? And if you think I'm nitpicking, let's see what he says next.
Well, really, I think there's no agnostics in foxholes. I think we all live either as we act as if there is a God, or we act as if there is not a God. Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying, but I don't know. For example, like I've never been in war, and I'm not familiar with any like research around that where I could like pull statistics out to say. But I think it is important, because if we say that the someone has to have knowledge to be a religious believer, we might be setting the threshold too high. I think to say, well, it's someone can rationally believe without having knowledge. That's something I'd agree with, right? I'm not saying that it's irrational. Maybe it's not too productive to get like bogged down on that point. It's just for me to say that my
That's interesting there. So Nathan earlier mentioned the Gettier cases. So the traditional explanation of what knowledge is justified true belief. I think Nathan may have mentioned that. The Gettier cases attempt to undermine that by positing examples where one has a belief that is true and apparently justified. Like Nathan gave the example of someone driving a particular type of car, and you see them and you form the belief that they own this particular type of car. In fact, they do, so you were correct, but that particular car they were driving wasn't actually the car that they own. So it seems that seeing someone drive a particular type of car is a reason to justify a belief that they own a car of that sort. So it seems you can have, in a case like this, a justified true belief, even though the justification is not actually sort of directly linked to the reason the belief is true. And so this is an attempted undermining of the idea of that knowledge is justified true belief. So anyway, the point is that Nathan here is saying that, well, as I understand him, you can potentially have a justified belief in something. He said rational, but I'm going to assume that's something like justified. You can potentially have a justified belief in something, even if it's not true, which, I mean, is definitely the case. So it's not going to count as knowledge. So I think what he's saying here is you can have justified beliefs, but if they're not true, then that won't count as knowledge. And possibly you could actually have justified true beliefs even, and they still not count as knowledge if there's other potential, like Gettier-like difficulty going on. So again, this is a subtle point here. I don't know how directly relevant it is to the main sort of question, how much evidence is needed to believe, but it's certainly along these sorts of lines. Again, let's see what the response is to this line.
my personal position isn't that I'd have to have knowledge to be a Christian. It's just that I think as I'm kind of like weighing these things up probabilistically, that the probability doesn't fall on the side of like Christianity being true for a variety of reasons. And I think I've forgotten the last point that you made at the end of the first kind of questioning bit now that I was going to get around to replying to eventually. First time
yeah. So
you asked me like a direct question, and it's slipped from my mind because of all the things that have happened since.
Was not sleeping. So there's no way I'm going to be able to remember, Nathan, but maybe I'll try and I can try where you went. I mean, I love that back and forth you guys just had towards the end there, especially. And I think when you talked about atheists and foxholes, that also got me thinking about how, at least in our culture over here, in the US, when people used to die in their homes, and when you had the large back porches where it was just a lot more kind of communal oriented, but especially when it came to death in community, there was nowhere near as much denial of death. There was nowhere near as much kind of distract ourselves away from death. There was nowhere near as much as kind of the Kubler-Ross understanding of death, where just naturalize it, pretend like it's not an issue, pretend like it's not a big thing, there's nothing to be frightened of. I think when we started moving in that direction, atheism and probably agnosticism became a little easier because...
So we get to some of the first really bizarre claims. First of all, there was a claim that there are no atheists in foxholes, or agnostics actually even, which is demonstrably false. If you just treat that as an aphorism, maybe that's what he was saying, but then it's unclear what the point of it was. I think charitably, the point of what he was saying, what I think Rob was saying, is that I'm going to assume that the positioning of the names is consistent with the positioning in the video, because I don't actually know who's who. So I'm just going to call the guy on the right Rob. Anyway, I'm going to assume the point that Rob was making is that you kind of have to make a decision about how to live, as an atheist or as a theist or whatever else. But I think that, in a sense that's true, but there's an oversimplification implicit there, because you don't have to just live as if you're 100% confident either way. For example, you can continue to question and continue to explore and be open to different possibilities, re-understandings of your faith, or even rejection of it if the evidence tips the other way. So it's not like you have to just go like all one way or all the other way in a sort of 100% confidence or 100% minus epsilon confidence that, well, maybe they haven't implied yet, but I think they kind of will imply a bit later, the way they talk about like accepting Jesus and so forth. So again, I think the whole, like, you have to pick a side is a bit overblown here. But coming to the point that was just made about death, this is even more bizarre. What is the evidence for the claim that people worry less about death than they used to, or are like less afraid of it? I don't really understand where this idea comes from at all. If anything, it seems the opposite. We're much more concerned about injury and death in modern societies when it's so less prevalent. We worry about much smaller risk. Health and safety regulations are much more stringent than they used to be. People fret about the tiniest little things that might affect the health of their children. Again, things that people never would have worried about because there were so much bigger things to be concerned about. I just don't see any reason to think that what he's saying is true at all. And also, it's a little bit strange. Like, is the idea that Christianity is good because it makes us fear death more? And it's bad that atheism makes us fear death less? Or if we fear death less, we're more likely to be atheist? I'm not even exactly sure what the point is supposed to be. So there's a very dubious empirical claim. And then I really don't understand the relevance in terms of how this relates to reasons, like, how much evidence is needed to believe. But anyway, if you're going to say that we fear death less than we used to in the past, provide some evidence for that. That's an empirical claim that needs to be backed up.
Because death in so many ways is like atheists in the foxholes, in the sense of that was the smelling salts for deciding, okay, is there truly a God or not? Is there a God I'm going to meet here in my suffering and ultimate death? Or is there not? Am I going to fall through this type of trap door into the arms of a loving father, or just into empty space?
Nice false dichotomy there. So either there's a loving father who'll meet us after we die, or, we disappear into the void. No possibility of, us being reborn into the cycle of, into samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth, as Eastern religions believe. No possibility of us becoming some sort of one with the cosmos in some sort of spiritual way that some sort of maybe pantheistic religions believe. No possibility of us being like, what's the point I was going to say there? No possibility of us meeting a pantheon of gods or like competing spiritual entities. That the point is that there's a false dichotomy here between like a particular version of Christianity and a particular version of naturalistic atheism. I mean, I am a naturalistic atheist, but why should we accept this dichotomy? I find a lot of Christian apologists talk in this way, that you either like those are the only two options, but they aren't the only two options. Also, is he just literally saying that you should become a Christian because otherwise you might, like, because of fear of death, basically? Like, is that, I mean, I want to be a bit more charitable than that and say that's not what he's saying, but it certainly sounds like that's what he's saying. Maybe he'll clarify.
And so when we had the great revivals over here in Connecticut, Massachusetts, even Vermont, thousands were coming to know Christ because they were really struggling with death. There were a lot of atheists in foxholes. And I don't think it was just fear of death that they said, okay, I'm going to take Pascal's wager and just believe in God. No, but I think instead it actually got them thinking more seriously about what is life and asking the big questions of meaning, purpose. Why am I truly here? And am I going somewhere or not? What was my origin? What was the purpose of my origin? It's kind of like Job talks about. And
so how can you distinguish between the case in which people come to belief because they fear death or bad consequences after death versus the case in which the idea of death just gets them thinking, and then, you know, they consider the evidence or the possibilities and then sort of rationally or in a justified way come to a belief in Christianity? How can you distinguish those two cases? Because presumably we want to say one is sort of rationally justified and the other is plausibly not. He's sort of, well, I don't know what he would say exactly about Pascal's wager. He's saying that that's not what's happening here. But maybe it's not even that. Maybe it's just people are afraid, and, you know, people cling to whatever seems to be offering them a way out, offering them hope. So again, he wants to say, no, that's not what's happening. It's at least more rational, more thoughtful than that. But again, what's the evidence for that claim? I mean, he's the one, Stuart, I'm assuming, is the one saying that death is this important thing for bringing people to Jesus. But then he's also saying, well, no, it's not an irrational, irrational thing. It's still rational, like still evidence-based, is the implication of what he's saying here. But he doesn't really provide the evidence for that.
And so dealing with that, I think, unfortunately, we have a level of what the philosopher Charles Taylor talks about, who's really big in Canada right now, where he talks about how there's this buffered self, where no longer are we fully in touch with the transcendent order. Instead, there's a buffered self where we are simply on.
How can you be fully in touch with the transcendent order? Transcendent means something that's well beyond and above, outside of humanity, right? I don't know how you can be fully in touch with that. I mean, different religious traditions throughout the world have tried hallucinogenic drugs, meditation, offerings, prayer, ritual dances, all sorts of things to try to gain access to this transcendent order. And I don't know of too many people who would say you can gain direct access to this, at least not in any sort of permanent way. And, you know, if you agree with Kant, then there's a sort of an what's the word I'm looking for? An uncoverable gap between us and our perceptions and then what exists outside us, especially things that are transcendent. So again, am I nitpicking? Maybe a little bit, but at the same time, this is similar to the point about death. Where does he get this idea that we used to be in touch with the transcendent and now we're not? Fewer people go to church than they used to. Maybe that's what he means. But like, going to church doesn't put you in direct touch with the transcendent order. It's just strange language and sort of vague things being thrown out there, which I think just get worse over the course of the video.
On this horizontal plane, and we're really no longer asking those big metaphysical questions, at least those kind of on the whole. But shifting gears here a little bit, if you want to comment on that, absolutely.
Well, there's something I'd want to say on just the point about death and so forth is, well, if most people are thinking about what's going to happen to them after they die, does that in any way guarantee the truth of a claim about what they expect after they die or what they know? So say if most people died and didn't care about what happened to them after death, would that increase your confidence that atheism is true? And similarly, you know, if most people die and think a Christian heaven or hell awaits them, should that then increase our confidence that Christianity is true? Because I think from my point of view, that what people believe is independent of the facts that are true in the world, the propositions that actually obtain. And I also think things like people being afraid of death is completely expected on naturalism. I mean, perhaps it's explained on theism as well. Maybe less amongst people who would be, you know, reassured with the Holy Spirit and stuff like that. But it definitely is expected under naturalism. So it doesn't seem to me to be a point that would count against that worldview.
I think the point that would count against naturalism would be evil and death, more so, and suffering. Why do we make such a big deal out of that as humans? It should be more so natural. You know, we think about the deers grazing in the savannah. When I said deers, I mean deer. And it would say it's a brother or sister, and the brother gets picked off by a lion. The sister's going to lift its head up, look around a little bit, but most likely go back to grazing. And so in a world where there's clearly no God, no religion, I think it'd be probably intellectually dishonest to smuggle in words of evil and why does this truly bother us so much? So that's on the naturalism side. I think on the other.
What? Can anyone make sense of what he was saying there? It seems like to be just complete nonsense. So a deer is grazing, and then their brother or sister deer, whichever one it was, is picked off by a lion. Okay, first of all, if that happens, the other deer is running away. It's not just going to stand around while the lion is eating its brother or sister. So the analogy doesn't even make any sense internally. Second point, what's this analogy supposed to be showing? I just have no idea how it connects to what he was saying. That like deers don't care about each other. I mean, I don't think that's true, but also humans are not deers, right? We have empathy and ability to abstract, put ourselves in other situations. So even if deer don't have empathy towards other suffering, that doesn't say anything about whether humans do or should, for that matter. Thirdly, what does this have to do with evil? So I think he was talking about suffering and evil kind of interchangeably. So he's saying, why should we be bothered about suffering? Because deers aren't bothered about suffering, even though clearly they are. That's why they run away from predators, unlike his bizarre example where it just sort of stands around grazing even when there are predators around. I don't know what sort of wildlife documentaries he's been watching, but I've never seen that happen. But likewise, humans also obviously fear suffering. Why should we be bothered about suffering? Because it's unpleasant. It's unpleasant for us, and then we can use empathy and reason to see that that's also going to be unpleasant for others, and that I think should concern us if we have any sort of empathy. Now, if you're a sociopath, maybe that doesn't concern you, but that's a whole other issue, right? You can have sociopaths whether you're religious or irreligious. Anyway, so what was the point of any of those comments? Deers don't behave that way. Humans are not deers. It's very easy to understand why humans would worry about suffering, because it's very unpleasant. What is supposed to be inexplicable on naturalism? I've completely have no idea what the argument is supposed to be. And it's just unbelievable how someone can throw out so much nonsense in such a short amount of space. But again, it gets better. Let's keep going.
Other side is whether it's C.S. Lewis or Kierkegaard or Leonard Bernstein, so many have talked about, look, if we have this desire, our hearts, or Augustine, our hearts are restless until they rest alone in you, O Lord. I think if we have this desire for God, that God-shaped hole that so many even secular psychologists talk about, and we have this desire to live an eternal life, I think it's very similar to what C.S. Lewis talked about when he said, ducks desire to swim. We desire to have sex. And in these things, there is fulfillment of these desires. We desire for food. We desire for a hot sunny day on a beach. And so, no, to your great question, absolutely, it's soft evidence, I would say. It's not hard evidence.
Okay.
It's soft evidence that desires ultimately do and will be satiated.
What is the difference between soft and hard evidence? I don't really understand when people use those terms. They seem pretty meaningless to me. But putting that to one side, this argument that if we have a desire for something, it means there must potentially be fulfillment for the desire strikes me as one of the dumbest arguments for theism I've ever heard. Honestly, I won't even grace it with a response here. Let's see what Nathan has to say.
Yeah, I think part of the issue with that is someone could desire that atheism's true, right? And then, given your own premises, you'd have to say, well, yeah, that guarantees the truth of atheism in the same, or it's a soft piece of evidence for, and this is the sort of argument where I think maybe we can see how it actually is symmetrical to both sides, and it doesn't really tell us anything about the conclusion. On the other point about morality, I'd be interested to there's different levels of explanation you can give. So there's the meta-ethical philosophy level, which is going to be where some people are thinking about these issues, and then there's also the
right. So just to again put some context here. So again, we saw this before when they mentioned some vague things about knowledge and skepticism. Here, I think it was Stuart mentioned some vague things about suffering and evil. I don't actually know if he had mentioned morality in that, although he does later. But now, again, Nathan is trying to unpack these very vague and loose statements and talking about, okay, so here's different ways we can think about that. There's sort of the meta-ethical question, and then he talks about some others as well. So again, let's see how he kind of unpacks this and what he says, and then what their response to that is.
But how could that actually physically happen on naturalism? Which is, and this is probably where most people kind of glibly kind of shrug off what most atheists would say. But I think again on naturalism, it makes perfect sense that beings like ourselves, with higher order thinking, with social mammals, we grow up around other mammals. We have a model of other people and how they're behaving in our brain, we can infer what it would feel like to be something else that's suffering. That's one level of explanation. Obviously, that doesn't give the philosophical explanation of like what are good and evil in themselves, but there are various things that people think that aren't theism about that question.
And I would just say to that too, like there's really only one commandment that flows from the logic of atheism, and that is might makes right.
Well, I think that's just the case on theism, actually, because I can't.
So, another bold assertion. The only commandment that follows from atheism is might makes right. I'd like to know how it follows from the proposition that God does not exist, which is the assertion that atheism makes, the only one that atheism makes. How it follows from that might makes right. So that's an ethical, maybe a meta-ethical claim. Not sure. Maybe it's a bit of both. How does that follow from God does not exist? I mean, at most you might say, and this is what William Lane Craig, for example, argues, that there's no such thing as subjective morality. But it doesn't follow... Like might makes right isn't really even like normative egoism, which is the view that you're morally obligated to do what's in your own self-interest. The idea that might makes right is like what is morally good is what the most powerful actor or person wants or commands or something like that. I guess that would be the idea. I mean, I don't know of anyone who defends that. But also, how does that follow from atheism? I mean, just what's the argument here? God does not exist, therefore the morally good thing to do is to obey or like follow the person with the most power, as defined. However, how do you draw that connection? It doesn't make any sense at all. So how did these bold assertions just get made and people don't just laugh? I mean, I'm assuming this isn't the first time he said something. Rob hasn't. I'm assuming this isn't the first time he said something like that. And Nathan has a good response to this, which is say, well, actually, that seems to follow more from theism, which literally says it's the all-powerful, deity out there who is the basis of morality, or at least some theists say this, especially those. Especially, I think that's what Stuart and Rob would say, given their comments. So let's see what they have to say about that.
I can't see how. Basically, why people should, for example, follow God's commands unless it's like a might makes right system. There's loads of it. Like I think there's more issues basically with the moral ontology of theism. So you've probably heard of like Euthyphro's dilemma, for example. I can't see.
Nathan, when you became a Christian when you were 20 years old, you believed in heaven, right?
Yeah, I did believe in heaven for a while. Yeah.
Right, some kind of goal, and to say that God is just going to drag people off and damn them, I don't see that in the Christian faith. I believe God has given us a free will, a choice, rationale, and when we choose love and we choose all of these moral terms and live them out, we're bringing more of heaven to earth. And if you want to just call that a term that we use to kind of progress the human race, well, that's getting towards naturalism. But I would posit to you, like, what is the physical evidence that atheism is true?
This is why this video is so difficult. So Nathan was talking about the Euthyphro dilemma. Rob switched topic and started talking about heaven and mentioned something about free will, and then asked Nathan to give physical evidence, whatever that means, that atheism is true. What do these things have to do with each other at all? There's no logic or flow through here. And it's at this point where I just become incredibly frustrated with the video. So the reason I'm responding to this is because I think it's important for people like me who, for some reason or other, feel drawn to this sort of stuff, help people to see the problems inherent with these types of reasoning. And I mean, there are many people who engage in this sort of reasoning as well. And I think people who tend to agree with that worldview will just not, I mean, not saying that they can't, but it's just easier not to just sort of not see the huge leaps and the unsubstantiated claims and so forth. So again, let's just put the Euthyphro dilemma aside because Rob doesn't seem to care about that. The claim about heaven and free will, there's a big problem with that because, well, a number of problems. First of all, at least as far as I understand Christianity doesn't say that God will ensure that people who treat others well and are loving and caring and generous and so forth. He doesn't say that those people will go to heaven. He says that people who accept Jesus will go to heaven. You could be all of those things and still go to hell if you don't accept Jesus, right? So I'm not actually sure how these things connect to each other. Also, what about all the people who never had the chance to exercise their free will to accept Jesus because they lived in China during the Tang Dynasty? Actually, there were a small number of Christians there then, Nestorian Christians, but most people hadn't heard about that, or like in India through most of history, or in the Americas before Europeans came. etc., etc., right? None of these people ever had the chance to exercise their free will and to choose to accept Jesus. They may have had the opportunity to do good in other ways, of course, but I think by your standards, Stuart and Rob, they would say that these people are still not going to heaven, I'm guessing. Now, if I'm wrong about that, then I'll stand corrected. But again, there needs to be a lot more unpacking done about that. So just to blithely throw it in there and then sort of throw it out and then start talking about the next point, which is to ask for physical evidence that God does not exist. Now, I don't think Nathan actually affirms God's non-existence because he's more agnostic. I think that's what he talks about. So I'll just sort of answer that comment, that question briefly from my point of view, because I am happy to shoulder the burden of proof as an atheist. It's going to be pretty hard, though, to offer physical proof that God does not exist because God's not supposed to be a physical being. I don't know how you can provide physical proof of the non-existence of a non-physical being. I mean, that seems to be a bit of a tall order. But from my point of view, there are many features of the universe that are much better explained from an atheistic than a theistic framework. One that I'll point to is the mere existence of the universe. Because if God is self-sufficient, why would he bother creating a universe? He doesn't need anything to enhance his glory or power or knowledge or anything like that. It seems that he's perfectly fine, self-sufficient, and all good the way he is. So why create anything? Now, I'm not saying that atheism can explain why the universe exists, but it doesn't seem to have a strong reason for thinking that it wouldn't exist, which, at least to me, seems to be the case under theism. There's also the problem of, what's the other one I was going to say? Oh, yeah. So there's the problem in terms of revealed religion of the enormous extent of religious confusion and the different faiths and traditions that exist around the world. Why do we have so many of them that have their own revelations or philosophical teachings that are so different from each other, and that none of which have very strongly evidenced like foundations, especially if you go far enough back? Why couldn't God have revealed the same thing simultaneously in like the Han dynasty in China, in the Roman Empire, into the Kushanas in India, and to the Persians, and to some peoples in the Americas for good measure, for example? And they could have all written it down, and we could date them all to the same time, and they could say the same thing, and the same theology could be verified across the world. That'd be pretty good evidence that God had revealed that to mankind. Then everyone would have God's word, and there would be strong reason to believe it, because we'd be able to tell that it was propagated in a way that couldn't have happened naturally. So why don't we have things like that? That's what I'd expect if God actually cared about making his presence known to us and making his will known to us. I think the fact that we don't have anything of that sort, not even remotely close to that, is strong evidence that, at least if there is a God, he's not very interested in our affairs. So there are just two things. There are many other things to say, but I think there are lots of reasons to think to favor atheism. Not definitive, of course, but to favor atheism over theism. Of course, the less you want your God to do, then the harder it is to find evidence that he doesn't exist. So if the only thing God ever does is create the universe and then sits back and does nothing, like the sort of creator deist God that just creates and then sort of chills out, then there are a few arguments against that. I think one argument would just simply be, why would he create the universe if he's self-sufficient as is? Seems more reasonable to think that he just wouldn't do anything. But anyway, that's obviously a longer conversation to have. One point I want to make is that it just often seems to not occur to people that such reasons could exist. And I guess the other point is just like, what does it even mean to offer a physical reason? Yeah, anyway, there's more that can be said about that, but let's hear what Nathan has to say.
Well, it depends. So, I mean, I'm not an atheist, but people who defend the atheist worldview, say, like philosophically, people like Paul Draper would basically make a probabilistic argument. So, if we're talking about like an explanation, there's features of an explanation that would make something like a better way of accounting for the evidence than not. And this is the same thing that theist philosophers do. So, like someone like Richard Swinburne will be saying, well, the best kind of explanation that we can give for natural laws and regularity or something is like a personal God. And that's exactly the same sort of thing that the atheist philosopher will do. Well, they'll say basically what they call source physicalism, by which they mean that mind, that there was matter preceding mind, or something like that. And I can't remember the other condition.
Right, like a watch and a watchmaker.
Is that what sort of?
That's kind of going in the line of like Descartes and Voltaire and some of them. But I think, it's kind of just to throw this out there, the best physical evidence for the existence of God is that the universe has a beginning.
Do you mean so? Well, there's a couple of ways of thinking.
Right, so maybe this gives us a hint as to what he meant before when he said physical evidence. So I guess it's physical in the sense that this relates to physics. The fact that the universe had a beginning is, first of all, not established. You can look at the video I did with Nathan about the Coulomb cosmological argument. There's certainly good evidence that the universe had a beginning, but it's not definitive. But putting that to the side, even if the universe did have a beginning, it's not at all clear how this is evidence for the existence of a God, because you have to ask the question as to why we should think that God was the one that created the universe, if indeed anything created the universe, and if it didn't just begin causelessly. Again, I talk about that in the video I did with Nathan. But the problem is not that one can't make such an argument. Of course, one can, and it's been discussed widely. It should be taken seriously. But instead of even sketching an argument, even referencing someone who's made an argument, is just to blithely assert, oh yeah, that's evidence that God exists, like that the universe exists. Well, again, I think that it's evidence that God doesn't exist. Because if God was self-sufficient and all-knowing and all-good and all that stuff, then he would. It doesn't seem like one can posit any logical or sensible reasons he would have for creating a universe. So therefore, if God did exist, he would not create a universe because he would have no reason to. I mean, you could break that down, right? First of all, God would only do something if he had a reason. Second of all, God could have no reasons for creating the universe. Therefore, God didn't create the universe. And therefore, if the universe required God to create it or to exist, therefore, if God exists, the universe would not exist. And since the universe exists, it follows that God doesn't exist, right? So I think that, I don't know if this has been argued before. I've just been thinking about this recently. I'm sure someone's argued this. But so to defeat that, you're going to have to say, well, God actually does have good reasons for creating the universe. Or you could actually say God just does things for no reason at all, which I think is interesting if you want to argue the universe is fine-tuned and like it's the foundation of like logic and mathematics and all that stuff. If God just does things for no reason. But if you want to say he did have reasons, well, then one can ask the question, what reasons? What plausible reasons could he have had? There don't seem to be any. Like any of the reasons that we have for doing things are the result of things that we lack or things that we would desire or experiences that we would like to have. But none of those seem to apply to God, at least from my understanding. So again, I'm not saying that nothing can be said in response to that. But it's, again, just like that there's a complete lack of conception of other ways of thinking about this. And even if you think that God could have good reasons for creating the universe, that's still not a reason for thinking that he actually did. That's just like he might have. Well, what are the other possibilities as well? How do you know it wasn't an immaterial, non-agentic force that created the universe, like the Tao in Tao's philosophy, which is not a person, but it's also not, at least to my understanding, entirely material or physical? Or Brahman from Indian philosophy, which is, well, I don't know exactly how to describe what it is. It's sort of vaguely person-ish, but it's not a person like the Judeo-Christian God. Maybe that something like that created the universe. Maybe the universe emerged from a timeless, but in some sense physical state, like unstable quantum fields or something, which existed timelessly, sans the universe, and then caused the universe to begin when it initiated the expansion of the spatio-temporal space, basically in the same way that God is supposed to have under at least some hypotheses. So there's a bunch of different possibilities out there. I don't think we really know. My predilections lean towards the physical explanation, of course, but I mean, it's speculative. But to just assert that, oh, that's the best physical evidence and not even explain it, again, it's just posturing as far as I can tell. Let's see what Nathan says about this.
About that, right? So there's two arguments given. One would be the contingency argument, and one would be like a Coulomb cosmological argument from vertical causes. I don't think that the Coulomb can work. So
again, we see Nathan doing this again. A vague, unsubstantiated claim was made. First of all, Nathan has to actually turn that into something a bit more concrete. So he's just assuming they're referring to something like Coulomb or contingency arguments, two different ways of arguing this. And then he's going to make a response to them. So he's doing all their work for them. They make vague claims. He then has to make them at least a little bit more concrete, like give them an argument that he can respond to, and then respond to it. And it's just absurd when you're doing a conversation like this in this sort of format. Anyway, let's see what Nathan says.
From horizontal causes, because the way that basically that it's predicated on what's called like an A theory of time for the universe to begin to exist, which is like an eternal present. I don't think that's true for a few reasons, but I think what the physical models describe is basically that there is an earliest point in the four-dimensional vector space in the earlier than direction, right? So that's just to say that there's a first point in this four-dimensional like vector space. Now, but a contingency argument is something different.
You're kind of summarizing Einstein's general theory of relativity, right?
But more like how we think about causation in physics. So what those arguments are doing is they're saying, well, everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence, and then they're tracing back that chain of causation to say, like, well, at the start there's a first cause, that's God. Now, the ones that work from what would be called like an efficient cause, like a physical cause, like 1 billiard ball hitting another, I don't think that kind of argument works. But the one that says that that works off of something called the principle of sufficient reason, which is to say that everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its nature or in the cause of its existence. I think that one works, because then you've got to say, well, for the whole 4-dimensional vector space, what's the explanation of its existence? Now, I don't personally think that you can get to a God from that, or even, especially like I think to get to a theistic God, because you're adding on these auxiliary hypotheses to the explanation that don't need to be there. But what I do think is that is one of the stronger philosophical arguments that could work for saying that there has to be like this necessary thing. But I don't think you can say much more about it than it has to be a necessary thing. Like, it's a far cry from like an incarnational God or a Trinity, or especially like particularly weird theological disputes that might go on in the church.
Right. So we're just staying on is.
So that's an excellent little summary there. Nathan briefly summarized some aspects of the Kalam and his line of objection to that, relating to the different theories of time, and then described in brief the Leibnizian cosmological argument that everything that exists, every contingent thing that exists, needs to have a cause or an explanation for its existence, and then articulated some. Well, actually, he mostly said that does kind of work, but then mentioned some potential concerns. So again, there's far more structure in what Nathan said than in what they said, because at least he pointed out some, like, identified specific arguments and then said some things about them. Let's see what they have to say in response.
God real, right? I mean, that's the part we want to stay with first, because I think that's like a whole nother subset that we could go at, because I think that there are reasons to see the evidence that it's pointing towards a creator, a mind behind all of the intelligence and the patterns of order within this universe, and the fact that the universe is expanding and growing colder. And thankfully, it's expanding and not collapsing. I mean, I think we wouldn't be having this conversation if it was. But our faculties, our rationality, our consciousness, our reasoning and ability to even have this conversation through language and understand those types of meaning, does that not point towards a rational, reasonable creator behind all of that?
So I think you get the idea of how this is so frustrating. So Nathan identified a couple of specific cosmological arguments based on what they said about the best physical evidence for God is the beginning of the universe. Nathan tried to make that concrete, responded in brief to those. And then what was Rob's response? To instead talk about, instead of actually responding to that, start talking about, sort of in vague terms, the fine-tuning or the structure of the universe, something about its expansion. I've never heard anyone say that the expansion of the universe is evidence for God's existence per se. I don't really understand how that works, but anyway. And then he starts talking about like logic and reason and language and rationality, and now that's supposed to point us towards God. So it's just spitballing, throwing out a bunch of stuff without any explanation or justification. There's no argument here whatsoever. It's just assertions. I could just say, well, the Easter Bunny exists because, look at all of the fluff in the grass. Clearly that's come from the Easter Bunny. Like, that's about as substantive as what we've got here. Why think that the fact that we can use language has anything whatever to do with God? There's all sorts of things one can say about the evolution of language and how it works in the brain and its communicative and social role and so on and so on and so on. What does God have to do with any of that? That there's no attempt made here at an argument. It's just really embarrassing, I think, for anyone who takes this. And I'm not saying all apologetics is like this, although I do see this in other apologists as well. I don't know if these guys think of themselves as apologists, but I think that's what they're doing. So it's just, you have to at least give a semblance of making an argument. Otherwise, I can't remember who said this, but anything that can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. So if you're not even going to construct a sketch of an argument, I'm not saying it has to be all fleshed out, but we need something, right? Other than just making vague assertions. So now that they've changed the topic yet again, we started talking about death, and then they moved to the origin of the universe, and now they're talking about rationality and language, and Nathan's going to respond again.
I think behind that, too, that goes back to, Nathan, your point on naturalism as well. When we think about reason for a second. Think about reason in terms of, and rationale and consciousness, like you were saying. From a
looks like I lied. Stuart's going to have his say. So let's see if he expands the argument a bit.
Naturalistic perspective, it doesn't really make much sense because we are driven to survive, survival of the fittest, but also to reproduce. And there's nothing about evolution or naturalism per se that tells us anything about why we should be reasoning animals. And so naturalism can't speak to that. But many naturalists as well as evolutionists are saying it's kind of a naturalist of the gaps explanation, where we're going to figure out that whether it's consciousness or why we are idea-making reasonable human beings at some point in the future. But I think there's a lot left unsaid when it comes to those as well.
So
pretty much saying the same thing as Nathan here. What on earth was all of that? So what's he saying, that evolution can't explain why we have reason, or like use language? I think that was the argument. Let's suppose let's just accept that. Again, no evidence given for that. No attempt to cite even the slightest bit. He said, oh, many scientists are saying this. Well, I mean, is that true? Who's saying this? Why are they saying it? But even let's just assume that's true. What does that have anything to do with atheism? I'm not exactly sure. Some apologists seem to confuse atheism and naturalism. They're not the same position. Naturalism generally entails atheism, although there are certain ideas of God that are not inconsistent with naturalism, like naturalistic pantheism. But let's say traditional understandings of God are ruled out by naturalism. However, atheism does not entail naturalism. Naturalism is a position that only the natural world, the things that we can study through science, that's all that exists. So no immaterial or, well, yeah, no like supernatural, non-physical entities like spirits or ghosts or magical forces or deities or anything like that, right? So that's not entailed by atheism. So suppose naturalism fails to explain why humans have reason. Well, maybe then we should abandon naturalism and adopt a different view. Thomas Nagel, I think, has done this, right? So, but he's not a theist. As far as I know, he's not a theist. So again, if the thing is, if you're going to identify a problem with naturalism, you can't then attribute that to atheism. You have to show that it's God specifically that needs to be invoked in order to fill that gap. Not that a gap's even been established, it's simply been asserted, right? But even if there is a gap, why does God need to fill that? What exactly is it about the existence of God that helps to explain why humans have rationality? Why does God want humans to have rationality? What does that have to do with the properties of God? I would think you need to invoke some sort of reason why God would want humans to have rationality, but that's not implied by God's existence. You just have to concoct an additional premise. Why did God create the universe? Well, he must have had a reason to do that. Why did God fine-tune the universe? Well, he must have had an extra reason to do that. It's not the same as creating the universe, right? Why did God make humans so that they have rationality and language? Well, he must have had an extra reason to do that. Why did God raise Jesus from the dead? Well, he must have had an extra reason to do that. So you need an additional reason or justification or a new premise to explain each of these new things that God is supposedly doing or that he has done. And none of them are entailed by any of the previous ones. Like, God could fine-tune a universe's existence of life, but still not have any interest in having humans who have language, for example. Maybe he's just interested in animal life. Like, for all we know, that could be true. I mean, you can't infer that from anything else that's been established, right? So this is the problem with appealing to God, is these sorts of explanations. It's explanatorily inept because the only things that because God can do anything. The only constraints on what he actually does are his desires or reasons for action, or motivations, if you prefer. But we have no constraints on what those could be, other than, I guess, what you believe theologically. So for everything that God is supposed to do, you need to invoke a new and previously unjustified assumption about why he would want to do that or have reason to do that. So it's a terrible explanation, because every new thing to explain just needs a new premise about God to explain it, which is not really an explanation. It's just pushing the uncertainty back one level, or the lack of understanding back one level. They have this sign on the wall saying, give me an answer. But if I ask, why do humans have language? You say, well, God wanted it that way. That's not an answer, because I just ask, well, first of all, how did it happen? Like, did he just click his fingers and then it happened? That's a pretty lousy explanation. But also, why did he want that? Like, I mean, that just pushes the uncertainty back. What's the reason for why he wanted it, right? So it's just a terrible way of thinking about things. It's a way to avoid thinking and avoid having to actually deal with uncertainty and complex evidence and like evolutionary explanations and whatever else. You just say, oh, no, it was God. End of story. I don't have to think anymore. It really bothers me, because I really value scholarship and critical thinking and science and seeking out truth, and not just settling for simple, easy answers that feel compelling but don't actually tell us anything. So anyway, really lame. It's not even an argument, just assertions. Let's see what Nathan thinks about it.
I think that like there's a ton going on here, right? So the first thing maybe to say would be that there's no way of like accounting for this on naturalism. I think we would expect it on naturalism. Maybe the first thing I should do is respond to what was being said about just us having rationality or being here and thinking and stuff, because it depends on what kind of inference you're making. So I think the inference that some theists will make is, say, from the fine-tuning of constants that allow life or something to a god, or from like you can't offer a scientific explanation of natural laws. Now,
so this has shifted a little bit again, although they did kind of mention this fine-tuning issue before. So I think it's legitimate for Nathan to respond to. But notice that this is different from the question as to like why humans have rationality or why we have language. So it's just all over the place. So many issues just been thrown out and not considered in any sort of logical way. And I don't think this is Nathan's fault because they're just throwing out so much. But let's see what he has to say about the fine-tuning point.
Personally don't think these arguments succeed, but that's one way of going about it. Another way of going about it would be like an argument from analogy, which would be to say that so biological organisms are like means fitted together for ends. So like the eye is like things fitted together for the end of seeing or for rationality or whatever. And you'd say, well, what else do we know that is like means fitted to ends? We'll say, I mean, I don't have a watch on me, so I'm going to have to go with the less elegant example of like a screw bottle top or something. But like, so we say, well, so something like a screw bottle top, we say, well, that's means fitted together for ends. And the thing that brings that kind of feature about in reality is it being the product of a mind. And so we can infer, because like effects have like causes, that the reason that we see means fitted together to ends in biological organisms is because they're the product of a mind. I don't think that kind of argument works. Basically, it did work before we knew about natural selection, but now we have an explanation that doesn't require a mind. So the premise that like effects have like causes is the one that fails there in that argument, because the effects don't. You know, we've got a different cause now that we can use to explain that. Just in terms of like, what would we expect on natural? So there's, I think there's a problem, maybe a difference in how we think about this. So I think often in these arguments, what happens is I can't like, so my worldview isn't trying to necessarily offer an explanation of absolutely everything. It doesn't claim to do that. And I think for some of these questions, like, you know, a complete theory of physics or how does consciousness work, there's like three conditions we could have. So we could say, well, what's better, a true explanation, a false explanation, or no explanation at all? And I'm happy to say, well, the true explanation is obviously the best of these things, then no explanation, then a false explanation. But I often find in these conversations that theists actually put the false explanation above no explanation. I think it's kind of...
Well, let's look at the sign behind them and see what that implication might have. Give me an answer. It doesn't actually say give a true answer, as long as it's an answer, right? We just need an answer. It doesn't matter how justified it is or how much sense it makes, or if it's a really explanatory or just a trite, satisfying but vacuous answer, as long as it's an answer. And again, you could say, oh, I'm picking too much about just this catchphrase thing. But I mean, I think actually phrases like this mean something. Like, I mean, who thinks that give me an answer is a good slogan or catchphrase or whatever, especially one that you put up on your wall behind you when you're streaming? It's such a terrible catchphrase. Like conspiracy theorists, cult leaders, charlatans, pseudoscientists, they all give answers. They're just rubbish answers, right? So we actually need, what we need is skepticism, critical thinking, rationality, logic, scientific method, all of this stuff to actually sift good from bad answers, justified from non-justified answers. And so, I mean, I think that it's a good point for Nathan to mention this, that it's better to remain agnostic or just withhold judgment if we don't know if the evidence is insufficient, rather than just grasping onto unjustified, poorly worked out, unsatisfactory answers.
Kind of this discomfort around not being able to completely answer the question. But I think we can say with some confidence, you know, like a lot of some of these features of rationality and consciousness, we can definitely we can explain certain elements of them on naturalism. Like, you know, we can talk about McCulloch-Pitts neurons and modeling of how certain areas of the brain work. And we seem to be building up that corpus of knowledge, which tells us more and more, but it's not complete yet. It doesn't tell us enough.
Thomas Nagel, a tremendously well-published and famous philosopher right now down the street at NYU, says that consciousness right now is just, it's giving naturalism a total run for its money, and that it's so far beyond us that we're not really close. And yet at the same time, we definitely have made strides in that direction. Here, I want to go back to, maybe we'll go back to a little bit more of a grounded.
So if Thomas Nagel says something, it must be true. Like, is that not just a blatant appeal to authority? And now they're shifting again. Nathan made a few comments relating to like the argument that like effects require like causes, which is kind of a watchmaker teleological type argument. And then he also mentioned briefly about some approaches that have been used to try to understand cognition a bit better. Maybe not consciousness per se, depending on how you understand that. And again, what do? They throw out a vague quote from Thomas Nagel, who interestingly is also not a theist. So I'm not entirely sure how that helps your argument, Stuart and Rob's argument. But now it looks like they're going to change the subject yet again.
The topic that you hit on, the might makes right with the 10 Commandments. Where were you going there?
Well, I suppose I see a problem with the sort of meta-ethical theories of like divine command theory and theism in general, where this isn't a defeater to God existing. It could be that God exists and one of these explanations of morality is correct. But the problems, as I see it, for what the theist wants to kind of have contradictions together in that worldview. So, for example, if God's commandments are good, the classic kind of Euthyphro dilemma, what is it? Does God command them because they are good? So then there'd be this thing, goodness, which is external to God's nature, which his commands have to conform to in order to be good. Or is just whatever, is it good because God commands it? So then just whatever God says happens to be good. And in a sense, that makes the commandments arbitrary, right? God could command anything. And well, there's a further issue, God does command some things that I would say are sort of, if you were to ask me, why am I a moral realist? Why do I think some moral propositions are true or false? I'd say it's because certain statements like it's always wrong everywhere to drown babies to death or something like that is just seems so true to me. Is like I'm as certain as that as I am of the table in front of me, or that 1 + 1 = 2. And yet we do find things like this in the Bible. So that there's issues for the morality question for theism on like, how do we account for it and explain it and maintain the sort of omnipotence that we want to grant to God? Or how do we not make it completely arbitrary? How do we make it meaningful? If we're saying God is goodness, God is love, we're making an identity claim, but it seems like we're actually trying to tell you some more information about God when we say that. We're not just saying God is God.
Let's come.
Okay, so Nathan's articulated, I think, some very good objections to a divine command theory view of ethics. He mentioned the problem of identity. So if you say that like goodness is just like what God's nature is, then it seems to mean that saying God is good is a tautology, just like saying bachelors are unmarried. Yet theists have typically thought it to be a very substantive and weighty and important claim to say that God is good. So that seems to represent a problem there. There's a problem of arbitrariness. Could God just command anything? There's problems from, if you believe Yahweh is God, then he seems to have actually commanded some horrific things. So 3 good objections there. I think there are others as well. Let's see what they say.
Come back to that. Sorry to interrupt.
Absolutely fine. I'm talking a lot.
No. It's good. It's helpful because I want to get your thoughts on something here too, and Rob, yours as well. Based off of kind of what you just said when it comes to divine command theory, as well as the God of the Old Testament and babies, perhaps bashing babies on rocks, which.
Well, that one could David. I think there's a way out in that one.
Yeah, there is. David, exactly. There wasn't wrong in terms of that's David's desire to responding,
which I think is good. Like I think. I'm so committed to a certain bit. Like I mean, not that
sort of an aside.
So when I talk to Christians, there's a couple of avenues they go down with these sorts of things. There's either, yes, this makes me feel uncomfortable and I struggle with it. I don't have an explanation, which is okay, but then it's not really good enough for me to kind of adopt that and believe. Or it's going to be, well, I can see the contradiction. I don't like the contradiction because it's really important that this is true. So I'm just going to defend this. I'm just going to whatever explanation I can come up with to make it make sense. And it often doesn't really kind of succeed very well, that approach. I prefer I just don't get this and it's difficult. That's my preference.
Right. And I love it too, because our modern sensibilities, we want to try and fit God into a box. And the ancient Near Eastern culture that God was operating in obviously is not going to let us do that. And if you talk to people in war-torn countries, they're having nowhere near as much of an issue with the God of the Old Testament as we do, at least here in our white, suburban, very cushy, comfortable apartments, for example. And so that's one to tackle, but that would take many sessions together. And
so it sounds like he's just not going to respond. But also that last comment really rubs me the wrong way. He didn't exactly say anything that I would argue is false, except for the idea that people from war-torn countries don't have a problem with like divinely invoked genocide. I'd like to know what citation he has for that, and what experiencing war does to make you think that it's more okay to, slaughter people in the name of God than people who don't experience that. Also, it's not even clear what relevance that has to anything, because you could just as equally say, well, I mean, most people throughout history haven't had a problem with slavery or, gender inequality or people not having any input into the operation of their governments, and to gross exploitation and servitude and like serfdom and massive inequality with no like systematic social welfare programs. Most people haven't had a problem with like husbands beating their wives and children, parents beating their children, and on and on and on and on, right? So, I mean, so what? Like, that doesn't mean these things are right. So anyway, he didn't really make any assertions there. He just sort of said some things. So I'm going to let that go for the moment. But I couldn't help but at least express a bit of concern about where he might have been going with that. But let's push on. So they don't actually want to talk about this issue of potentially bad divine commands. So what did they want to talk about?
I want to go back though, connected to this one, kind of the main thrust of what we want to get through here today, and topically, is the evidence. And I personally believe that...
Wait. We want to go back to the evidence? What have we been talking about for the last 37 minutes? Haven't you just been trying to say that the best evidence is the beginning of the universe, but then you didn't want to respond to that? The best evidence is like language and rationality, but you didn't want to respond to that when Nathan made some comments about it. The best evidence was that there's like no evidence, well, like the problem of like to being skeptical and that's unlivable, but you didn't really want to respond to that when Nathan discussed it. And Nathan also mentioned some sort of fine-tuning arguments in brief that you didn't really want to respond to. He also mentioned some objections to divine command theory, which you didn't seem to want to respond to. That's not a direct objection to theism per se, but like you've been talking about the evidence, but you haven't actually responded to anything Nathan has said, nor have you made any arguments. All that Nathan has really been doing here is making Stuart and Rob's arguments for them, and then making some comments about them, presenting his perspective. I'm still waiting for an argument as to why we should think that theism, or Christianity specifically, is something we should believe in. All that I've heard so far are just assertions without any justification or explanation at all. So perhaps we're finally going to get some after 37 minutes. Let's see.
So much of the evidence and this knowledge that we originally talked about starting out, I think so much of that is really based in this topic that we're talking about when it comes to, is this God of the Old Testament somebody that is truly lovable and omniscient and the most beautiful thing imaginable? I mean, isn't God supposed to have the best attributes that we can imagine? So for me, when I talk with atheists, often...
I mean, I feel like I can imagine a God who doesn't command genocides, but anyway.
Times they will say, no, this Jesus, I mean, they'll rip Matthew 10 out of context, for example, when Jesus talks about a sword and dividing families, dividing spouses. Finding Jesus, I mean, the way God revealed himself to us in the Bible, I'm talking strictly about Christianity right now, is that something that's attractive to you? Or is it something that's offensive, perhaps, because it's saying you have to be saved from something? That's just a question to both of you guys.
Wait, what? Stuart said he wanted to talk about evidence, but now he's asking he's asking Nathan, and also Rob apparently, whether the vision of Christianity, or like the idea of Christianity, is attractive or not. What's that got to do with evidence? It seems that they just... Throughout this conversation, there's just no flow through of ideas. It's just like, oh, here's a thing, here's another thing, here's another idea. How do you connect any of this? What does this have to do with the question of evidence? Again, you can sort of see why I found it extremely frustrating to listen to, because there just seems to be no connection between any successive comments or questions that they make. But I may skip through a part of this because I want to focus on the actual topic, which is how much evidence is needed to believe. So let's see how we go here.
For the way I answer that is, like I certainly find it depends how you interpret it.
Yeah, so he says he finds certain types of Christianity more attractive than others.
No.
So hang on, let's see what Rob has to say.
Like, sort of don't think it's true, though I find it compelling. Like, there's lots of things I find
conversation here. Like, if I were to fly over to England and have a 3-dimensional conversation with you, there'd be different dynamics to it. You would perceive me in a different light.
Right.
And so the accommodation argument is just from very old, is saying that God became human in order that we might know God. But
it's really hard. The question, I get that, but the question is, why ought I think that's true? Like where it's not to do with do I find it compelling? In fact, the fact that I want it to be true, that I want it to be compelling, should be a reason for me to think, actually, I'm biased in that direction. Am I going to accept evidence that isn't?
Yeah, exactly. This is what I was saying before. This isn't an evidential question. It's not an irrelevant question, but it just doesn't seem to be related to the question that they're supposed to be talking about and what Stuart said he wanted to talk about.
Quite good enough for the, like if I if I really wanted someone to be into me or something, or I really wanted, I don't know, to get a position on a sports team or something, maybe I'm going to ignore the warning signs of things being wrong because I want it to be true so much. And the question for me is like, yeah, that's a beautiful story, but there's a lot of beautiful stories out there. And why should it then become more than that? Why should I suppose it's true of the world?
Mm-hmm. And I think that's why you go back to, are the Gospels reliable? What is the evidence for them? What was the claims and the character like of Jesus Christ? What were the character and claims like of Muhammad, of Buddha? I mean, Buddha's was great. Houston.
Now we're jumping to something else again. We're jumping back to the reliability of the Gospels, which I skipped a little bit at the start, but I don't really think they talked about this then, and they haven't talked about it since. And the character of Jesus. I mean, you can't really assess that without assessing reliability, because the Gospels are Christian propaganda. They explicitly say so, and that's obviously what their purpose is to make Jesus out and his teachings and everything to be as attractive as possible. So that doesn't mean that they're all wrong, of course, but you have to read them through that lens, I think, if you're trying to make a balanced judgment about how likely they are to be true and accurate. So I'm not sure how much we can tell about Jesus's character on the basis of the propaganda that we have. Maybe some things that we can say with more confidence than others. I'm not saying Jesus was a horrific person. I think that there's a lot to admire in his teachings, but the idea that we can get some sort of unbiased historical lens on what he was like, his character was like as a person, I think is really problematic. And that's true for a lot of other figures as well. Like the Buddha, for example, we don't really have any contemporary documents about his life. I think what we do have dates to centuries later, and likewise, that's essentially propaganda as well, so shouldn't necessarily be trusted. I think we have more contemporary accounts of, well, maybe not exactly contemporary, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, most of what we know about Muhammad's life, I think, comes from the Hadith, many of which are from some generations afterwards. I don't know as much about the historical side of that. But again, a lot of that is also biased as well, so you wouldn't necessarily expect to trust that. But also, I mean, when we're just talking about the nature of the God in the Old Testament who, orders genocides and other strange stuff, and we were told that, well, you can't fit God in a box. And then so we just sort of put that to the side. And now we're supposed to judge the character of Jesus. But the thing is, Christians claim that Jesus is God, so his character is revealed in the Old Testament as well. And I think we have, assuming that you trust that, and I think we have more than enough evidence to say that Jesus was, if you regard the Old Testament as like completely accurate, and also regard the God of the Old Testament as being the same person as Jesus, then Jesus is awful. He commands genocides and to take sex slaves and all of these other horrific punishments for small infractions, and doesn't forbid slavery and, all of these other things, right? That doesn't sound very nice to me, and it doesn't seem like the sort of person I would want to follow or worship. So I'm not exactly sure how this is supposed to be an argument in favor.
Smith, who wrote kind of the top book on world religions, said the two most powerful as well as just world changers in history were Buddha and Jesus. And they weren't just asked, who are you, but what are you? And Jesus was the only one who claimed to be God. And so he has the standard.
Well, it's important to say who the evangelists.
I was about to say that. How do we know that Jesus claimed to be God? All that we know is that in the Gospels, it reports that he claimed to be God.
Wrote claim to be God in some of the Gospels, right? Because
some of the Gospels, yes.
The problem is we've got to come to that belief without presupposing it, without assuming it beforehand. So it's like, at what point?
Can you do that right there? Sorry to interrupt, but can you do that? We just said, how can you make that statement without
which statement? Sorry, the one.
I might have to skip this part because it's just really difficult. So Rob is asking, how can you claim that you can't assume your conclusion? I mean, I think that's just what he's asking. And Nathan just patiently explains that if you assume your conclusion, then you haven't actually demonstrated anything. I mean, are we trying to teach logic to 9-year-olds here? I mean, I don't want to be rude, but seriously, like, why would you ask, how can you not assume your conclusion? You can't assume that the Gospels are completely reliable in that they report accurately everything that Jesus said, including that he claimed to be God. The only people who will generally be happy to do that are people who already believe that Jesus is God. So that is assuming your conclusion. If the premise is Jesus claims to be God, the justification for this is it says so in the Gospels, and then you ask why trust the Gospels, the premise seems to be that, well, Jesus was God, right? And so he ensured the Gospels are reliable, or like God ensured that they were reliable through inspiration. Now, there might be other arguments you can give as to a general reliability of the Gospels. None are presented here as far as I can recall, but that still wouldn't establish whether the specific claim that Jesus claimed to be God, which I think a lot of historians do not admit. And this is much less clear if we start with the earliest gospel, Mark, where it seems that Jesus is, he's a teacher, people call him rabbi, and he seems to potentially claim to be the Messiah, but no evidence that he's claiming to be God incarnate. And so I personally don't believe that Jesus claimed any such thing. I think if he did, he would have been executed almost immediately as a straight up case of blasphemy, right? But anyway, that's just my opinion. But this is a question that one has to, how do we know that Jesus did claim that? Rob seems to be just assuming that because, well, if the gospel says it, right, that's a circular argument. If in order to establish the reliability of the gospels about that fact, you need to already believe that they're inspired. And that's the point that Nathan is making. And so for Rob to ask here, well, how can you say that circular reasoning is bad? I mean,
the one that you just did, saying that we have to come to that without presupposing.
Well, just because it's like a formal logical fallacy. If begging the question is on the table.
Yeah, so I don't. What Nathan says is perfectly fine here, but it's just I don't even know why we have to have this discussion. It seems ridiculous. Let's see.
Get to that being true.
Well, there's kind of that argument that a fish doesn't know it's in water till it's out of water, right? Like you can only remove a being out of its environment so much to be able to get some kind of objective.
Did you see when he said objective, he put scare quotes around it? That's interesting. It's usually Christians who talk about objectivity. Now, I don't think they actually have so far, so perhaps I shouldn't impute other people's views to them. But that's interesting if we're going to put objectivity in quotes there. And that seems to be almost making a Kantian argument here about the what we can perceive and then the world outside of that, and we can't ever directly access that, which I agree with, by the way. These are skeptical arguments, which is what we started the discussion with, and actually Nathan made some of these. So yes, you can't, the analogy is a fish doesn't necessarily recognize that it's in water because that's what its environment always is, just like we don't really feel that we're in an atmosphere. We kind of know that, but generally we don't feel it unless it's a very windy day or something, because we're just used to that. That's fair enough, and it is very difficult to put yourselves in different worldviews. I think that's relevant for Stuart and Rob and other Christians, just as it is for Nathan and me and for anyone else, right? That it is hard to put yourself in the worldview of someone else. But I think this is a broadly skeptical claim that should make us more humble and willing to listen to other people, not as an apparent refuter to what Nathan is saying, where he's simply just making the point that we can't just trust everything the Gospels say on the basis that some people think that they're true, right? That would be circular. So that's all Nathan is saying that led to this comment that, well, fish don't recognize the water. What is this supposed to mean? We're just supposed to assume Christianity is true. Why not just assume anything else is true?
Perception. So to say that, I'm a Christian because of my parents or because I grew up in a Western country, I think is a type of closed-mindedness. Really, I think that the Christian faith.
Nathan never said that, by the way. I don't know where he got that from.
Veracity around the world and open knowledge, open to criticism, in such a way that it's not just saying, well, you have culture blinders on if you become a Christian.
I think I understand the reasons you're saying, and if I'm not understanding them, do say. But it sounds like you're saying though that lots of people believing it, or it being open to criticism, mean that it's true. And I don't think that that's the case. So I could see a time where, say, Islam becomes the dominant world religion, but that wouldn't make Islam true.
No, I'm not saying a mathematical probability or a numerical advantage makes something true. Right. Okay. In the same way that I was trying to show that genetic fallacy objection is self-refuting. With this notion of the church and Jesus and God becoming human, it's not necessarily just because of the numbers or because the center of Christianity has moved around the globe. It's more looking at the teachings of Jesus, seeing if they make sense, applying them and living them out of my life, and then saying, okay, does this make more sense than Buddha or the Prophet Muhammad or whoever making this choice?
Let me just step in here. I think where numbers do matter is in terms of how Christianity has spread and grown and traveled throughout time. It's the only religion where it started is no longer really the hub. Now it's not the capital anymore. I mean, talk about the spread from whether it's the Far East, then to Europe, it's in the U.S. Now it's China, Latin America, Africa. You're talking about Islam. I mean, that's the Middle East. Yes, it's growing over here in the U.S. because of immigration, certainly, but it's not going to be the capital anytime soon in any one of these places. And I think that's where, like Lamin Sana up at Yale talks about how Christianity, unlike any other religion, speaks to the hearts of people, no matter the tribe. And he's African, and he's talking about so many of the Africans.
So I don't think Nathan picks up on this particular point, but like this is a question to Stuart. Has Stuart ever seen a map of world religions ever? I mean, maybe he has, right? But he doesn't seem to have internalized it. So I actually want to show you, because these absurdly ignorant and ridiculous points just irritate me so much. So I think I might have to reshare, let's see, this tab here. Here we go. Hopefully you can see that. Okay, so this is a map of different world religions. I mean, you can find different ones. This seems pretty good to me. Okay, so we've got different versions of Christianity here. Oh, look, they've even got Mormonism. So Catholicism is in red here. You can see, of course, that it's mostly centered in sort of Southern Europe, and of course in parts of America, and mostly actually Latin America these days. You've got Orthodoxy in the east here, Eastern Europe, part of the Balkans, Greece, and Protestantism in largely North America and also Northern Europe. And it's also got Australia, New Zealand down here, and South Africa. We have Hinduism in India, and Sikhism we see up here, which originated around there. We've also got different forms of Buddhism in Mongolia and Tibet and sort of Southeast Asia. Now, the point I wanted to make about this is, let's think about where major religions originated. So Hinduism originated in India, and it's largely stayed there, although there is Bali. Yeah, there's the island of Bali, which is Hindu. That's a little export. It used to be the case that many of these regions here in what's currently Indonesia and these other Southeast Asian states had much more Hindu influence, but that sort of died out over the centuries. But Hinduism largely is an Indian religion, it is true. Let's look at Christianity. So Christianity originated in the Holy Land, and it's actually largely died out there. I mean, there are certainly still Christians there, but it's a significant minority religion now. And in its early days was mostly in the Eastern Roman Empire, so this region here, which is currently majority Muslim, a substantial majority. It's actually its headquarters, if you can call it that, I guess, is either moved to Europe, depending on which denomination you are, or I guess to North America potentially. So the location of Christianity, the centers of Christianity has certainly moved. But let's look at the other religions. So Islam originated in sort of Medina, I guess, which is around here somewhere, and has spread throughout Northern Africa, down East Africa, into Turkey, Central Asia. The largest Muslim nation on earth is actually Indonesia, which is in Southeast Asia. So Islam has spread over this region of the world from this starting point here into a huge variety of different cultures, from Central Asia through parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, northern Nigeria, to Indonesia and Persia and so forth. Let's look at Buddhism. Buddhism originated in India around Ganges River here somewhere or other. I don't know exactly. Northeastern India. These days, Buddhism is very small in India. Buddhism's largely died out in India. And the largest Buddhist regions of the world are really Southeast Asia. So particularly like Thailand, Burma, Cambodia, and also Tibet, Mongolia, and it's a bit harder to say, but also sort of China to some extent, although Chinese religion is very complicated because of communism and mixtures with Taoism and other things. So the center of Buddhism has completely moved from like here to over here. The center of Islam is in some sense where it always was, but it's dramatically spread out across a huge range of different cultures. Judaism, interestingly, sort of started in this area, they were largely expelled from there after the uprisings in 80-70 and 80, what was the other one, 130 or something, under Emperor Hadrian, spread out over the empire. And then more recently, following World War II, we've had a migration back to the Holy Land. So they've kind of moved multiple times. And also another point to make about the spread of Christianity. So certainly the majority of Christianity these days is in the Americas. How did it spread there? Well, it spread there mostly through colonial settlement in the north and some in the south, and also through essentially a combination of extermination and forced, or at least highly coercive conversion of the local population. So I'm not exactly sure how that speaks to the truth of Christianity when, if you know anything about the history of the Americas, there wasn't really a free choice of like, do we want to continue with the traditional Aztec religion or the Inca beliefs? I don't really know much about them. I don't know if much is known about them, or other traditional Native American beliefs, or, you know, do you want to convert to Islam or Buddhism or whatever else? No, there was no such thing as that. It was people bringing religion with them from Europe, and the natives being either killed or forced, or just being left with really no other alternative, no other people who would help them other than the church, particularly in regions like Paraguay, where it was often like Jesuits who were doing a lot of work with the natives there. So I'm not saying it was all bad. The church did some good, or did a lot of harm as well. But the point is that there was no free choice of religion, right? And there's no sense in which that there was a competition of ideas to see which religion spoke to people's hearts the most. And that's the same thing with Christianity in Australia and New Zealand, by the way, and in sub-Saharan Africa, which, again, mostly spread through colonialism, directly or indirectly. Likewise, we can say the same thing about Russia. So early Kievan Russian princes were converted to Christianity, and one of them later married a Byzantine princess, which helped consolidate orthodoxy there. And then those settlers spread right across the Siberia. So anyway, the point is that this argument is completely ridiculous. It's true that Christianity's center has moved, but so is the center of, in particular, Buddhism, and Islam is spread out dramatically across the world. Even other religions like Mormonism. Mormonism started in New York, and the center is now Utah. That's quite a ways. So also, the spread of religions has a lot more to do with settlement and politics and wars than it has to do with pure just conversion on the basis of the merits of different faiths. Now, it feels almost ridiculous that I had to go through all that, but when people make these absurd claims without any basis, I feel like that it's incumbent on people to call them out on it and say, no, this is ridiculous. That's not how it works. You're dramatically oversimplifying and ignoring important facts, like the fact that Buddhism center has moved as well, as has the center of Mormonism. And it's not even clear what that tells us about anything other than, you know, contingent historical facts about the movement of peoples and political forces. Like, if Constantine hadn't converted to Christianity in the early 4th century, would we still have had the history that we've had? Do you want to say that Constantine's rebellion, because he was actually a usurper, do you want to say that his rebellion was like divinely inspired or something? You just get to all these ridiculous positions that I don't think have any, you know, you can really defend at all. Anyway, let's get back to the video. Oops, hang on, I did that wrong. I'm still learning here. I'm still learning. Okay. Yeah. So there's this guy who waffle. Okay, let's see what Nathan has to say. Okay, so everything you just said was pointless. Got it. So Nathan was talking about Islam, Mormonism. Can't remember if he mentioned Buddhism, but then when pushed, Stuart starts talking about like fringe, very small cults, which it's unclear what that has to do with what Nathan was saying. And now somehow Thomas Kuhn's idea of paradigm shifts in philosophy of science, what does that have to do with anything? It's just, there's no connection drawn between these different ideas. Somehow we've gone between the fact that different religions spread around the world to the different cults compared to Christianity, which wasn't what Nathan said. Then now we're talking about paradigm shifts. Where's the logic here? What's the actual argument? What's the connection between these ideas? It's just like, it's almost mental diarrhea. It's just stuff coming out. Thomas Kuhn didn't say anything about this. He was focused on philosophy of science and in terms of the acceptance and rejection of different scientific paradigms. It really has nothing to do with what we're talking about here. Not many Jews believe that. Obviously, a few Jews at the start did, although it's unclear exactly how early that belief was. But I'll grant that some Jews believed it. But for the most part, Jews didn't accept Jesus. That's why there are still a lot of Jews around today. If most of them are converted, then Jews in the Roman Empire would have become Christians and not stayed Jews, right? So it's mostly Gentiles who were converted. That's interesting. If Jesus' disciples doubted it, even though they knew Jesus and he told them and they saw his miracles, isn't it reasonable that we doubt it when we don't have any of that evidence? So he's just throwing things out at this point. We don't have any reason to believe any of these things because he's not demonstrated that these documents are factual. Again, I could just say, well, look at all the people who witnessed the Battle of Helm's Deep in Lord of the Rings. There's so many witnesses to that. How could we doubt that it happened, right? I mean, it's just, I think Nathan actually goes in the direction of the Flying Man, which is, I think, Pine Creek's, well, I don't know if Pine Creek invented it, but comparing the idea of you see a claim in a book and would you believe it? But anyway, the point is Stuart's not established that any of these things should be believed. There are so many bizarre and strange claims that are made in theological, religious, or sort of mythological texts throughout the world. And it's really unclear why we should accept these claims that 500 people saw anything, especially when we know that there are lots of groups of people who see things, like many sightings of the Virgin Mary, for example. There's others that I talk about in my book, Unreasonable Faith. But anyway, Stuart doesn't seem interested in any of that. He's just throwing things out at the moment. How do you know that anyone talked to those eyewitnesses? All Paul says is that some of them were still alive, and he's talking to people in Corinth, which is, I don't know, hundreds of miles away from Jerusalem. Why would we think that anyone who saw Jesus would have contact with anyone in Corinth? Do you know how many people today don't believe that coronavirus is real, don't believe that the earth is round, don't believe in global warming, don't believe in vaccinations, believe in like lizard conspiracy theories? How many people believe in chemtrails? How many people believe that 9/11 was a conspiracy, that the moon landings were hoaxed? How many people believe that the earth is 6,000 years old? And on and on and on it goes. This is despite the fact that we live in the information age where it's easier than ever to look up this information and to find and access people. There's that case of the guy who built a balloon and killed himself eventually because he was trying to prove that the earth was flat. He died for his beliefs, right, that the earth was flat, even though it's super easy to disprove that. It takes half an hour on Google to find immense evidence to counter that. Now, that's an extreme. Most people don't die, right? But the point is that there are so many people, even today, who believe the most ridiculous things that are easy to disprove. And we're supposed to believe that people in a pre-scientific age who had very little access to communication, most of whom would not have been very literate, if literate at all, somehow were that interested and had the ability to then go and talk to people who lived years, possibly decades earlier in a place hundreds of miles away, where they would have not potentially have spoken the same language, because many people spoke Aramaic in Jerusalem or Israel compared to Greek in like Corinth. And we're supposed to think that this hypothetical ability of possibly some people to check out these vague claims, when even though we know people are not very skeptical to begin with, that is the basis we have for assuming that these things must have been true. That is unbelievably flimsy. What evidence do we have that any Christians did that? Now, plenty of Christians were persecuted, but I'm talking about Christians being persecuted and giving up land, liberty, and children specifically for having seen Jesus. I'd like one citation of a a known person whom we have record to have done that. I don't know of any cases other than maybe Paul himself, possibly. Except Paul didn't see the risen Jesus. He saw a vision of Jesus years later. But I'm talking about people actually at the time who supposedly saw the risen Jesus. I don't know of any evidence to support the claim that Stuart is making here, other than like later Christian tradition, essentially, that comes from well after the point, and obviously has, you know, an apologetic purpose. Oh, by the way, another group that you could say all of that about, the Mormons. They suffered a lot of persecution that pushed them out to the West. And at least some of them actually did. Like, we have written records of them saying, hey, I saw the gold plates. I handled them, or I saw them. An angel brought them to me. And other people who helped Joseph Smith with the translation saying that they felt them under the cloth and so forth. So we have their names. We have, you know, signed documents from them. And we know that these people suffered a lot of persecution. And we have, again, documented evidence that they had to flee lands and leave things behind and had families split up and so forth. That's way better evidence than we have for anything about early Christianity. But I don't think Stuart's too bothered about that. So why the double standards? Citation needed. Wait, so is he saying that Jesus and or Paul weren't charismatic figures, that people potentially would have been? I mean, we know that Jesus was, right? That's very clear. Lots of people followed him. The word about him spread around. This is what the gospel's saying. It seems quite reasonable. Is there were teachers like this who were charismatic? Do you really think Jesus wasn't a charismatic teacher that, you know, people would have been really eager to follow and potentially die for? What reason do we have for thinking that you can put Jesus in one category and this, I don't know who he's talking about, David Koresh guy, in another category, or like other, you know, charismatic teachers and preachers? It's almost as like he thinks that Jesus was like a super boring, dour person that you would have no reason to be interested in, except I don't think he would agree with that. So it's really hard for me to understand what the point of this argument is. Yeah, I think so. So this is the flying man thing. So I this is about as far as I got through the video on the first listening. So let's see what they say about this. Right. So apparently I'll be talking for an hour and a half, and no one can actually hear what Stuart, Rob, and Nathan have been saying. I suppose I might as well finish this out since I've gone so far through it. I've kind of summarized their views. I don't know if I'll re-edit this later. I don't know why that hasn't worked. But anyway, so Nathan and Stuart and Rob are just talking about the whole flying man thing. And I mean, it's interesting that we're seeing a bit of skepticism come out now about, oh, how can we trust this document and so forth, which I think is obviously questions that are perfectly valid. But again, just remember before that they were quite happy to make claims about, oh, you know, Jesus appeared to 500 people in the Gospels, and Jesus said he was God, and so many people gave up their lives and so forth. And you know, this was just asserted without any basis for like, why should we trust these documents? But then now they're asking, oh, you know, how can we trust this, and what evidences do we have, and so forth. Now they might have more to say about why we should do that for the Gospels, right? But they haven't said anything about that here, and they've had almost an hour to make that point if that was significant for them. So I don't know. I think that, yeah, let's just see where they sort of finish up there. I'll have to figure out this sound so I can do streams like this and actually have it work in the future. So there, Rob's asking how coherent is the writing. You have to look at that in order to assess its whether it's true or not. I mean, this seems to be a very simplistic standard here. I mean, I can read Lord of the Rings, which Rob actually mentioned there. I mean, that's pretty coherent to me. Like, it's a pretty good story, right? So does that mean it's true? Obviously not. And actually, there are a lot of things in the Gospels, or like, I guess, the Bible more generally, that are not very coherent, especially if you compare different like Gospels with each other. If you take the death of Judas, for example, which seem to present two completely different narratives, or the birth narratives being another example. Now, you can try to harmonize those away, but I mean, you can try to harmonize anything away, right? So if you're willing to do that, then this coherency point doesn't really seem to hold much water here. So now Stuart's just throwing out more stuff, just like he has been this whole time. He just said, what, character, corpse. Let me play that back again. It was a real, like he said this a million times before. I haven't actually said this now. Character, claims, corpse, reliability of the Gospels, cumulative evidence of that. Well, see, that's not evidence. That's just claims. claims. Corpse is just evidence that someone died. That's hardly an interesting statement. Character, well, how do we know what the character of Jesus is when we can't necessarily trust the details of the Gospels? Let's say we trust the general idea that, you know, Jesus taught these things and he went to these places and, you know, he existed. But the details of his character, the specifics of it, how he comes across, how do we know that that is accurate any more than we would trust a Mormon published biography of Joseph Smith as presenting those? Even if the general details are accurate, how do we know that all of the specifics are accurate? And that, I mean, this is what the Mormons do. They excise nastier things, like that Joseph Smith was a treasure hunter throughout his youth and that he married multiple women. Some of whom were married to other men at that time. They just don't talk about this, or at least didn't until recently, until people sort of forced them to with the internet. But so the point is, that's exactly what I would expect to happen with early Christianity as well. They just remove things that aren't flattering and emphasize things that they want to show. So a character, I don't know how I can get to Jesus' character in an authentic way unless I just presuppose the Gospels are completely reliable in all these respects. Corpse is not evidence for anything. And in terms of the claims that he made, well, again, I can't get to those because all I have is the Gospels to mediate that. There is evidence, I think, to think that Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, which is interesting, but not enough unless you just trust the Gospels to assert, I think, that he claimed to be God. Even if he did claim to be God, there's quite a few people who claim to be God. And how do you decide which of them is actually God, if any? And I think perhaps it's most parsimonious to say none of them are actually God. So Stuart's saying that atheists say that there's not enough evidence, and why isn't God clearer? But he's saying that a lot of atheists say that they don't have a clear idea about how much evidence they would need. Maybe they could actually talk to Nathan and ask him that rather than saying what other atheists say. So he's using the analogy about marriage and like you have to eventually take the leap of deciding whether you're going to propose to a woman or not, which a lot of apologists use this analogy. It's really unclear how relevant that is to the claim he's making, because we don't actually know anything about like Jesus. Again, unless you just assume the Gospels are reliable, you can meet a person that you're thinking of marrying or whatever. You can actually experience their character. I mean, you can't fully know someone, but you can get a lot of information about spending time with them, right? Through spending time with them. None of this is relevant in this case because we can't spend time with Jesus. We can't. I mean, maybe we can. Maybe there's another way we can have a relationship with him. But Stuart hasn't explained how that's supposed to work. He's just talked about the Gospels and some other vague theological concerns. How do we get to God's character through that? How do we even establish that God exists? I mean, this analogy is so silly. If you're thinking of marrying someone, there's never a question in your mind as to whether the person exists or not. And it's much easier to get information about their character as opposed to just reading some text and hoping that those are accurate. So I've never understood how this analogy is supposed to be relevant. If the agnostic or the atheist like me is saying we need more evidence, perhaps we'll start with, let's establish that the person that you're saying that we should devote our lives to actually exists. And then maybe I'll take the marriage analogy a little bit more seriously. So Stuart's asking Nathan what would be enough evidence for him. Yeah. Let's get on to the question. Okay. So Nathan's using the example that Pine Creek uses from Kings about setting, a damp cloth on fire or something like that as a sign of God's power. Oh, now we're on to Jordan Peterson. Oh, some of his friends have seen limbs grown back. Oh, he's saying you're skeptical about those stories. Seems reasonable. So we didn't really answer Nathan's question about the whole miracle thing, but yeah, I'm not super interested in this sort of miracles question thing. Let's see if there's anything else that I want to comment on before finishing up. So Rob here is saying it's not just our five senses that give us knowledge. Wonder where else we can get it from. What? So Rob is now saying that our senses can be unreliable, I think, because we're not focused on things. He's using the example of the gorilla that walks across the screen and you don't see it because you're not focused on it. Not sure how that really is relevant. Oop, now we're back to fine-tuning of the universe. So he's just mentioned Einstein and Stephen Hawking, neither of whom were really theists. Einstein was some sort of pantheist, I think, if you're interested in his religious views are a bit complicated, but I don't think he was a theist. Now he's talking about how Jesus talks in parables, because I'm not really sure what that had to do with anything. I didn't understand really any of the point of what Rob was saying there. Think might finish up soon. Let's just see what Stuart's... Yeah, they're looking to wrap up. When the Russians went to space, this is an interesting line. Oh, they said God's not up there, right? So Stuart was saying that if God did want us to relate to God, then God would write himself into the story of humanity, like coming to earth like God, like Jesus supposedly did. And now he's giving some sort of Indian story. I don't even know what that has to do with anything. So Stuart's saying that the most beautiful story is that God's trying to reach us by becoming human and then dying for us. And he says if that doesn't speak to someone, then there's something wrong with that person. And then Nathan says if we find a story good, that doesn't make it true, which of course is a very good point. Now Stuart's appealing to experiential fulfillment from that worldview. Needs to be existentially satisfying, which I would broadly agree with. Yeah, okay, so I think we get that point. Just want to see if he's... Okay, I think I'm going to leave that there. They're talking a bit more about the existentially fulfilling stuff, which is important, but I think that... To draw things together a bit, this was a very wide-ranging conversation, as I've said, very poorly structured, I think, particularly on the part of, well, mostly on the part of Stuart and Rob, because as I've said, systematically, they make these bold assertions with no justification or explanation at all. And then Nathan has to come in and sort of clarify what were they talking about, give some structure to that, and then respond to it. The title of this was How Much Evidence is Needed to Believe, but Stuart and Rob said almost nothing about evidence. Now, they mentioned it in a few different guises. They talked about problems with being too skeptical, that's not livable. They talked about like arguments for the beginning of the universe. Like, they mentioned them. They didn't explain them. They just sort of said, oh, God's the best explanation for that. They talked about rationality and language and like, why do we have that? And naturalism apparently can't account for that. They talked a bit about fine-tuning. This was mentioned now and then. And like, you see God as the fine-tuner or whatever. They talked about Jesus's claims to be divine and how great a story that is and how people wouldn't, give up things to be alive. They also talked about the fact that Christianity is like moved around the world and its center has changed. So these were the points that they made, but none of them were structured in anything vaguely like an argument, like here's what we should believe because of this reason, and here's why you should accept these premises, or here's how that makes sense. It's just like claims, like, oh, Christianity's expanded around the world more than other religions. Like other religions haven't done that, so what? Like it's not even clear what's supposed to be said about that. Oh, like beginning of the universe is the best evidence for God. Why? Well, how does that work? Oh, you can't account for language or rationality under naturalism. So what? I mean, naturalism is not even the same as atheism, but like, what does God have to do with any of that? So repeatedly, as I've been talking about through this stream here, they just make these claims, no explanation or very little, bold assertions, sometimes factually inaccurate, like the religions thing that I mentioned, the map that I talked about. And I think Nathan's been very patient with kind of breaking that down and giving plausible responses. And then it seems whenever they're pressed, they basically just switch to a different line of argument. I showed this multiple times throughout the video, how they did this. Nathan respects something, and then they just talk about something else. They didn't, I think, provide any evidence for believing or provide any real answers other than a few sort of vague assertions like, well, you just sort of have to believe because it's fulfilling and because Jesus said these things, so you have to trust that or whatever. If this is apologetics, I think it's extremely poorly done. So again, I just wanted to, the purpose of this video was to articulate why I was so frustrated with this conversation, and I think Nathan was a lot more patient with them than I would have been, given their ridiculous and unfounded claims all over the place and failure to sort of connect anything. So hopefully I've shed a little bit of light onto what the problems with this sort of brand of apologetics is, and how it's like, there are these claims made that sound intellectual, and they sometimes appeal to random scholars or whatever, or quote people or whatever, and it superficially sounds intellectual, but there's actually no substance to it. Nathan sort of brought that out, and hopefully I've sort of provided some insights there. So yeah, it's rather annoying to know that the video that I was playing was not actually audible. This was my first experiment with this, so I will have to sort out why that didn't work. So I guess I'll leave it up for now, and I'll see if later I want to go through and edit something or add captions or whatever it is. But you can, of course, check this video out for yourself. The title is shown there, so you can look it up to view the bits. But I generally summarize what they were saying anyway, so perhaps you can get something out of this. So hopefully you found this interesting. I think I'll be sort of, if I can figure out how to get the audio part working properly, practice doing with some more of these, responding to apologetic stuff or just other things that I think are interesting. It seems that there's just more nonsense being released all the time. Yeah, so thanks guys, and I guess I'll maybe talk to some of you next time when on this coming, Sunday, I'll be talking with Nathan. We'll be doing another Bad Apologetics episode, this time on like worldview comparisons and free will and stuff. So if you're watching soon after this is released, you might want to check that out. Cool, otherwise, see ya.